There are 12 pairs of human footprints on the moon right now. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally, physically sitting there on the lunar surface, pressed into the gray dust by the boots of real human beings who walked there over 50 years ago. And here is what makes that almost impossible to wrap your head around. Those footprints look exactly the same today as they did the moment they were made. No wind has touched them, no rain has washed over them. No shifting of soil or decay of any kind. The moon has no atmosphere worth mentioning, no weather systems, no erosion in any traditional sense. And so those marks are just sitting there, frozen in time, perfectly preserved, waiting. They are, in a very real sense, the most undisturbed human footprints in the history of our species. And yet, the people who made them, the people who stood on another world and looked back at a blue marble hanging in black nothing, they came home, and nobody followed them. Decades passed. Generations grew up. The world changed in almost every conceivable way. And somehow, returning to the moon just never quite happened again. That is one of the strangest facts of modern civilization if you sit with it long enough. We went to the moon. We pulled off one of the most extraordinary technical achievements in the entire history of human endeavor. And then we just stopped. The reasons are complicated, tangled up in Cold War politics and budget pressures and shifting national priorities. But the effect is simple. Those footprints have been waiting longer than most people watching this video have been alive. Now, there is a new program aimed at changing that. It is called Artemis. And if you have been following space news at any level, you have heard the name. NASA announced it officially in 2017. And from the very beginning it was framed as something different from Apollo. Not a race. Not a flag. Planting demonstration of national willpower. The stated goal of Artemis is to establish a sustained human presence on and around the moon. Regular missions, infrastructure, the kind of ongoing relationship with our nearest celestial neighbor that the Apollo era never actually achieved. The vision is ambitious, genuinely exciting, and when you look at what it would mean for humanity's long-term future in space, it is hard not to feel the pull of it. But to understand where we are today, you have to understand where we started, and more importantly, you have to understand the gap between those two things. Because the timeline of Artemis, when you lay it out plainly, tells a story that is both fascinating and sobering in roughly equal measure. The Apollo program, the one that put those footprints on the moon, morbid wheat. Speed that still seems almost unreal when you examine it. From the first flight of a heavy rocket capable of reaching orbit to the moment Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, 8 years elapsed. 8 years. And this was not 8 years of modern computing power. Not 8 years of advanced materials science and computer-aided design and the accumulated knowledge of a global aerospace industry. This was 8 years of engineers working with slide rules, of missions where the astronauts understood the hardware well enough to fix it mid-flight, of decisions made in real time because there was no other option. The pace was breathtaking. The risk was extraordinary. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. Artemis was announced in 2017. As of now, the manned lunar flyby, not the landing, just a flyby, has only recently been accomplished, and we will definitely return to that. More than 9 years after the program's announcement, human beings are only now completing the preliminary, crude phase of the mission architecture. When you compare those two timelines side by side, the contrast is stark enough that it demands an explanation, and the explanation is not what most people assume it is. The instinct, when you hear that a major space program is running behind schedule, is to attribute it to bureaucracy, or mismanagement, or some failure of will or vision at the organizational level, and it would be dishonest to say those factors play zero role. But the deeper truth is something more interesting and more structural than that. Modern space missions are not delayed because we have gotten worse at this. They are delayed, in significant part, because we have gotten far more serious about it. The architecture of an Artemis mission is almost incomparably more complex than anything the Apollo program attempted. There are more systems, more contractors, spread across more countries, each responsible for a component that must interface perfectly with everything else. There are more stages that have to happen in the right sequence, with the right parameters, at the right time. The mission is not a single spacecraft built by a single agency. It is an interlocking puzzle of hardware and software developed by different teams under different contracts, each piece of which has to work perfectly, both in isolation and in combination with everything around it. When any one element falls behind, the ripple effect moves through the entire system. Delays do not stay local, they propagate. And then there is the question of risk tolerance, which is perhaps the most important factor that rarely gets discussed in the way it deserves. In the 1960s, NASA and the astronauts they were working with accepted a level of danger that would be considered completely unacceptable by modern standards. Not because anyone was careless or cavalier, they were not, but because the alternative was not attempting it at all. Decisions were made quickly, sometimes with incomplete information. Problems were discovered in flight and solved in flight, or occasionally not solved at all. The price paid for that speed was real. 3 astronauts died in a fire on the launch pad during Apollo 1. Others came close to not coming back. The program pushed forward anyway, because the geopolitical and historical stakes demanded it. Today, every system has to be verified before it flies. Every potential failure mode has to be identified and addressed in advance. Every seal, every valve, every line of code has to pass through a testing regime that is orders of magnitude more rigorous than what was considered sufficient 60 years ago. This is not weakness. This is wisdom earned through hard experience. But it means the pace is slower. And it means that when problems arise, and problems always arise, they are caught and corrected before they can threaten a crew, rather than discovered in the middle of a mission when the options for fixing them are far more limited. To see what this actually looks like in practice, you only have to look at what happened when Artemis was preparing for its first manned mission. The Space Launch System, the rocket at the heart of the program, was rolled out to the launch pad with the Orion spacecraft on top. A structure that rises close to 100 meters into the Florida sky. Just looking at something like that gives you a sense of the scale involved. This is not a piece of technology you can iterate on quickly. This is a cathedral of engineering, and every component exists in relationship with every other component. And getting it right matters in a way that is not true of most human endeavors. One of the critical milestones before any launch is what is called a wet dress rehearsal, a full simulation of the launch sequence, including actually loading the rocket with running through all the countdown procedures as if it were the real thing, and then stopping just before ignition. It is the closest thing to a launch you can do without actually launching, and it is specifically designed to catch any problems that only appear when the entire system is active and pressurized and running at operational conditions. During the first attempt at this rehearsal, a liquid hydrogen leak was detected. This is not a surprise, exactly, because hydrogen is extraordinarily difficult to contain. At the temperatures required to keep it in liquid form, we are talking about roughly 252 degrees below 0 Celsius. The properties of materials change dramatically. Seals that work perfectly at room temperature can lose their elasticity and develop microscopic defects that allow hydrogen molecules, which are the smallest molecules that exist, to slip through. This is a known challenge in rocket engineering. It does not mean someone made a mistake. It means they caught a problem before it became a catastrophe, which is exactly what the testing is for. The connections were disassembled. The seals were replaced. Everything was put back together and tested again. The second attempt at the wet dress rehearsal went cleanly, with no leaks detected. Progress. But then a different issue emerged. During the purging process, the part of the procedure where systems are cleared of residual propellants and pressurized with inert gas, engineers discovered that helium was distributing unevenly within the upper stage of the rocket. Helium is used in the upper stage to maintain pressure in the fuel system and ensure everything operates correctly during flight. If it is not distributed the way it is supposed to be, the flight is at risk. Here is the problem with where that fault was located. It was inside a component that could not be accessed while the rocket was on the launch pad. There was no way to reach it, inspect it, and fix it without rolling the entire rocket back to the vehicle assembly building. A massive, complicated, time-consuming operation that the public rarely sees discussed, but that represents exactly the kind of setback that turns weeks into months. The rocket was rolled back. The work was done. Everything was prepared again. Antisysty. thing that is genuinely important to understand about all of this. None of it represents failure. Every one of those discoveries, the hydrogen leak, the helium distribution issue, was a success of the testing process. Those problems were caught before a crew was on board, before the engines lit, before there was no way to stop what was happening and bring people home safely. The delays that followed from those discoveries were not the cost of incompetence. They were the price of thoroughness, paid deliberately because the alternative is unthinkable. Once a rocket finally launches and the crew is on their way to the moon, they are entering an environment where the physics are unforgiving in ways that require some explanation. Because the trajectory a lunar mission actually follows is nothing like what most people picture when they imagine space travel. The instinct is to think of it as a direct route, aim the rocket at the moon, fire the engines, coast across the distance, arrive. That is not how orbital mechanics work. And the actual reality is both more complex and more beautiful. After a spacecraft launches into low Earth orbit, it is moving at roughly 7.8 kilometers per second. That sounds impossibly fast, but it is exactly the right speed to keep falling around the Earth in a circle without actually hitting it, which is what an orbit fundamentally is, a continuous fall that keeps missing the ground. From this parking orbit, the crew performs what is called a translunar injection burn, an engine firing at the point where the spacecraft is closest to the Earth. This burns for a relatively short period, but the energy added is enormous. The speed jumps to somewhere between 10 and 11 kilometers per second, and the orbit that was circular becomes dramatically elongated, stretched out so that its far end reaches all the way to the moon's orbital neighborhood. Now, here is the part that trips people up. As the spacecraft climbs away from Earth toward that far end of the ellipse, it slows down significantly. This is not a malfunction. This is conservation of energy, behaving exactly as it should. The closer an object is to a massive body like Earth, the faster it moves in its orbit. The farther away it gets, the slower it moves, as kinetic energy converts to potential energy. So a spacecraft that was moving at nearly 11 kilometers per second just after its burn can be moving at only a few hundred meters per second by the time it reaches the vicinity of the moon. The trajectory, when you draw it out, looks almost like a straight line because of how elongated the ellipse is, but it is a curve, always a curve, governed by the geometry of gravity. As the spacecraft approaches the moon, something else starts to happen. At first, the moon's gravitational influence is negligible. Earth's gravity still dominates the spacecraft's motion completely. But as the distance to the moon decreases and the distance from Earth increases, the balance shifts. There is an imaginary boundary, a sphere of influence. Engineers and physicists call it in which the moon's gravity becomes the dominant force acting on the spacecraft. Once the vehicle crosses that line, it is no longer primarily falling around Earth. It is falling toward the moon instead, drawn in by the moon's pull, and its trajectory changes accordingly. For crewed missions where the primary objective is testing rather than landing, a particular trajectory design called a free return profile is used, and understanding why it exists is key to understanding the philosophy behind modern lunar missions. A free return trajectory is engineered so that if the propulsion system fails completely at any point, if the engines never fire again after the injection, the natural geometry of the trajectory will still bring the spacecraft back to Earth. The crew will be in danger, certainly, but they will not be stranded. The path home is built into the physics of the flight plan itself. This is a deliberate, meaningful trade-off. A free return trajectory cannot take the spacecraft into low lunar orbit. It passes the moon at too great a distance, and with too much speed for orbital insertion to up in naturally. It limits how close the crew can get to the surface, and how much time they can spend in the vicinity of the moon. But what it provides in exchange is something more valuable than proximity, guaranteed return option that does not depend on anything going right. In a phase of the program that is specifically about proving that the crew systems work safely before committing to the full complexity of a landing mission, that trade-off makes complete sense. Contrast this with the Apollo missions of the 1960s, and the difference in philosophy is immediately clear. When Apollo spacecraft entered lunar orbit, they were not on free return trajectories. They flew in close to 100 kilometers above the surface or less, and they performed multiple orbits, sometimes over the course of several days, gathering data, refining navigation, conducting observations that could not be done from Furter, Hawaii. This gave mission teams far more time to work and far more flexibility in what they could accomplish, but it required multiple additional propulsion maneuvers, each of which had to go exactly right, and it left much less room for recovery if something went wrong. The very first human beings to reach the moon, not to land, but to actually travel to the moon and orbit it, were the crew of Apollo 8, which flew in December of 1968. This mission was a pure demonstration of the orbital mechanics involved. No lander, no surface operations, just the command module, 3 astronauts, and a flight plan designed to prove that the whole scheme would work. After the translunar injection, it took 3 days to reach the moon. And then came the moment that decided whether the mission succeeded or failed in its core objective: the lunar orbit insertion burn. Getting to the moon is one challenge. Getting into orbit around it is an entirely different problem. The spacecraft arrived, moving faster than the moon's gravity could capture on its own. To enter orbit, the engine had to fire to slow the spacecraft down, a retrograde burn, firing in the direction of travel to reduce speed. If the burn did not happen, the spacecraft would swing around the moon and head back toward Earth on a trajectory that might or might not bring it home safely, depending on the geometry. If the burn was too short, the spacecraft would not slow enough and would not be captured. If it was too long, the spacecraft would slow too much and the orbit would be too low, potentially intersecting with the lunar surface. The burn happened on the far side of the moon, where the spacecraft was out of radio contact with Earth. Mission control could only wait a night warkeep. Apollo 8 entered a roughly circular orbit approximately 112 kilometers above the lunar surface. The crew spent 20 hours in orbit, completing 10 loops around the moon before performing the burn that sent them home. As they came around from the far side on their 4th orbit, they looked out their window and saw something that had never been seen by human eyes before. The Earth rising above the lunar horizon. Landers photographed it, and that image Earthrise became one of the most reproduced and discussed photographs in history. A sudden visceral reminder of what a small, fragile, beautiful thing the planet actually is. What Apollo 8 proved, at its technical core, was that the entire chain of maneuvers required for a lunar mission could be executed successfully. The translunar injection, the coast, the capture, the orbit, and the return. All of it was validated in a single flight. It was the foundation on which everything that came after was built, including the landing missions that followed less than a year later. Now, returning to the present, all of that history casts the Artemis program in a particular light. The first Artemis mission, Artemis I, was unmanned, a test of the Space Launch System and the Orion spacecraft together. It launched in November of 2022 after delays and setbacks that stretched across months, including those wet dress rehearsal issues described earlier. When it finally flew, it flew well. The rocket performed correctly. Orion was placed on the right trajectory. The spacecraft completed more than 3 weeks of flight that included a close approach to the moon in time in a distant retrograde orbit. And it came back and splashed down in the Pacific with all primary systems having functioned as designed. That was a genuine accomplishment, worth recognizing clearly as such. The second mission, Artemis II, was always intended to be the crewed equivalent, the same basic mission profile as Artemis I, but with 4 astronauts aboard. A free return trajectory, a lunar flyby, no landing, no extended time in lunar orbit, but real human beings in the Orion spacecraft, traveling farther from Earth than any human beings since Apollo 17 in 1972. The preparation for this mission went through all the challenges that were described earlier. The leaked seals, the helium distribution issue, the rollbacks, the retests. And after all of that, the mission ultimately happened. The crew made it around the moon and came home. Another genuine accomplishment. Box checked on the path toward something greater. What comes next is the landing itself, and that is where the complexity multiplies again. A landing mission requires a lunar lander, and the lander selected for Artemis is the human landing system being developed through SpaceX's Starship program. Starship is itself one of the most ambitious pieces of hardware ever attempted. a fully reusable launch vehicle and spacecraft. Combination that would need to be launched separately from the crew, placed in lunar orbit rendezvous with the Orion spacecraft, carrying the crew, transfer the astronauts, descend to the surface, and then return them to Orion for the trip home. Every one of those steps is its own engineering challenge. Every interface between systems developed by different organizations is a potential source of complications. The schedule has continued to evolve as various elements have needed more time. But here is what matters. Underneath all the timelines and the setbacks and the comparisons to Apollo, the physics has not changed. The moon is still there, 384,000 kilometers away on average, swinging around the Earth in the same orbit it has followed for 4.5 billion years. The footprints are still there. The challenge of getting humans safely to the surface and back is exactly as difficult and exactly as achievable as it was in 1969. Not easier, because we still have to contend with all the fundamental realities of propulsion and orbital mechanics and life support in a vacuum. And not harder, because we have 50 years of additional knowledge and technology and engineering, experience that the Apollo teams never had access to. The difference between then and now is not capability. It is culture and complexity, and the weight of what we know about what can go wrong. Apollo moved at the speed it did because the stakes of the Cold War made risk acceptable in ways that are simply not true today. Artemis moves at the speed it does because it is being built to last, not as a moment of national triumph, but as the foundation for an ongoing human presence beyond Earth. Those are different goals that naturally produce different timelines. When the next crew lands on the moon, they will be landing near the South Pole, a region Apollo never reached. They will be going there specifically because orbital observations have suggested the presence of water ice in permanently shadowed craters, water that could potentially be extracted and used, water that could be broken into hydrogen and oxygen and become rocket fuel, water that could make the moon not just a destination but a way. The goal is not to plant a flag and leave. The goal is to understand what resources exist and begin figuring out how to use them, how to build something that can sustain itself, how to make the moon a place humans can keep returning to not for a few days, but for weeks, eventually months. That is a fundamentally different kind of ambition than Apollo carried. Apollo was about what was possible at the edge of human capability in a specific historical moment. Artemis is about what is sustainable at the beginning of a much longer story, and sustainable things, definition, take longer to build. There is something quietly profound about the fact that those bootprints from 1969 are still sitting there, perfectly intact, waiting. They represent a moment when humanity stretched itself to its absolute limit and touched something that seemed irreachable. And now, more than half a century later, we are going back not to revisit that moment, but to extend it, to transform a one-time achievement into a permanent relationship with another world. The delays are real, the challenges are real, and anyone who follows the program closely understands that the path forward is neither straight nor smooth, but the path exists. The rocket exists, the spacecraft has flown with crew, the physics is understood. The engineers who are solving each problem that appears are some of the most skilled people in the world, working on something that will matter for as long as humanity exists as a spacefaring species. Every seal that is replaced before it fails in flight, every helium distribution issue that is caught and corrected in testing, every rollback that delays a launch by weeks in order to prevent a disaster that would delay the program by years, all of that is the program working the way it is supposed to work. It is unglamorous. It does not make for dramatic headlines. But it is how you build something that is meant to last. The footprints will still be there when the next crew lands, and if everything goes the way it is designed to go, they will not have to wait much longer.